Hello and welcome back to I Completed 80s Music with me, the 80s Mixtaper. Hope you've all had a good week so far and are looking forward to the weekend. Today we plunge into the second half of Playlist 36 in February 1982. But before we do, social media has been lit up again with all your lovely comments, corrections and recollections. This time to the introduction of the Human League and their song Sound of the Crowd. It feels like Phil Oakey's hair and debut brought back a lot of great memories on Threads. Koyanu said, got all the Human Lead singles and always wondered what the red and blue tags meant. Now I do, thanks. See, this pod is not just fun, it's educational too. Mike Owen said, when she was a teenager, my ex in Sheffield delivered the daily papers to Phil Oakey and Joanne Catherall. They were always really pleasant and gave a generous tip at Christmas. Oh, that's nice. Antoine Hicks said, this song had a massive impact on me aged 15. Over on TikTok, Andy White 871 said, remember buying it when it came out. Raymond Ray 006 says, dare to be ahead of its time and still an awesome LP. Terrible pun there. One Day at a Time 52 said, I actually had that haircut. And Paul TTFO 689 added, so did I. Yeah, Phil Oakey's hair. Blimey. If you've not seen it, it was sort of like a long dark curtain on one side, flipped over his head and shaved on the other side. Kind of a mad look. Anyway, if you'd like to contribute any musings to the pod, you'll find me on your socials as the 80s Mixtaper. Or if you're old school like me, you can email me at completed80s@aol.com. That's completed80s@aol.com. So what do we have in store for February 1982? Well, we're going to introduce Bohannon to the picture. And that's a name which probably won't mean much to my British audience, but really, really should. That's going to put some bounce in your step, I promise you. Then we'll explore the birth of the British hardcore scene before diving into some more Robert Palmer and UB40 stories. We then meet up again with Funboy 3 and introduce a very important girl group to proceedings called Bananarama, before ending today with some more Depeche Mode as Vince leaves the group. Due to copyright laws, we can't now play the songs on the pod, but to remedy this, I have created playlists for both Spotify and Apple Music, which you'll find in the episode description. So what the idea is, while on a walk or something, you listen to a bit of the pod, queue up Spotify or Apple Music, and then listen to the song and flick between the two. So, without further ado, let's get back to the music. We start today with some of the funkiest funk the 80s produces, but I bet most of my British audience won't know the track. But if you're in the mood, you're going to love this. We're talking about a man whose name is practically an onomatopoeia for the sound he created. Bohannon, Bohannon, Bohannon. It's a rhythmic incantation, a metronomic heartbeat that suggests, even before the music starts, that your heart rate is about to be synchronised to a very specific, very relentless frequency. Hamilton Frederick Bohannon was a drummer, but he was so much more than that. He curated the pulse of the late 20th century. Born in Union, Georgia in 1942, he was a percussive child prodigy. After earning a music degree from Clark College in Atlanta, he briefly taught music, but the classroom couldn't hold a man with that much internal rhythm. By 1964, he was the primary drummer for a 12-year-old Stevie Wonder, a gig that functioned as a high-stakes apprenticeship in the science of the groove. In 1967, he moved to Detroit and became the legendary bandleader for Motown Records, the man responsible for the live arrangements that kept Marvin Gaye, The Temptations and the Supremes on their toes. When Motown famously decamped for Los Angeles in 1972, Bohannon stayed in the Motor City. He didn't want the sunshine, he wanted the steam of the factory floor. He stayed to build his own mechanical, hypnotic brand of funk, predicated on Earl Young's invention. 4 to the floor. A kick drum, a straight, unwavering quarter note thud that would eventually become the foundation of house, techno, and every EDM track currently vibrating the windows of a car near you. Which brings us to track 8, playlist 36. This is Let's Start to Dance Again. Enjoy this one, press play now. What an absolute tune, and I bet a lot of you haven't heard it before. Released in the US in 1981, Let's Start to Dance Again is the moment the sweat of 70s funk met the cold, clinical precision of 80s electronics and rap music. It reached number 1 on the Billboard Dance Disco chart and number 4 on the Soul chart, effectively proving that the death of the genre was not entirely true, but I mean, is this really disco at this point? Amazingly, it only ever reached number 49 in the UK charts in February 1982. After leaving Motown's orbit, Bohannon had spent the 70s refining a sound that was often unfairly maligned by jazz-leaning critics for its monotony and repetitiveness. But those critics were listening with their brains when they should have been listening with their feet. He was building a trance. By the time he launched his own Phase 2 Records label to release this track, he had perfected a formula of syncopated rhythm guitars and a heavy, unchanging bass line that created a physical environment rather than just a pop song. The 1981 version is anchored by the vocals of Dr. Perry Johnson, whose exuberant shouts would go on to become some of the most heavily sampled phrases in the history of the global dance floor and rap music. This wasn't just a sequel to his 1978 hit Let's Start the Dance, it was a hardening of the sound for a new era. As noted by music historians, this version was another bridge to the future, stripping away the lush, orchestral fluff of the mid-70s disco and replacing it with a raw, percussive energy that anticipated the arrival of Chicago house and the relentless loop-based structures of hip-hop. Bohannon understood that a good groove doesn't need to go anywhere, it just needs to be. The song's DNA is everywhere in the lexicon of modern music. It was famously immortalised in Tom Tom Club's 1981 classic Genius of Love, which we heard in episode 30, where Tina Weymouth famously name-checks Bohannon alongside James Brown and Sly and Robbie. Later on, the track gets sampled 35 times by everyone, even by Betty Boo doing the do. Even pop royalty like Kylie Minogue utilised the track's energy. Bohannon proved that if the beat is right, you don't need to change the channel or even the chord, you just need to keep the wheels spinning. He remained a cult hero and a drummer's drummer until his passing in 2020, leaving behind a rhythmic blueprint that every producer from Detroit to Ibiza is still attempting to decode today. He was the man who taught us that the dance doesn't end, it just starts again. For track 9, we switch gears again, for a band with one charting entry. This one is an assault on the senses, but it's the voice of a scene we've yet to introduce. Let's meet a band that stood at the epicentre of a very specific, very loud and very brief explosion in British music history. We are talking about the UK 82 movement, the second wave of punk, and one of the bands that gave that movement an iconic face, Vice Squad. The song is Out of Reach, released in 1981. It is a track that captures a band at the peak of their independent powers, right before the major labels came knocking and everything got complicated. Press play now. Before we get into Vice Squad, we need the context of what happened to punk when the class of 77 grew up, broke up, or sold out. By 1979, the mainstream media had declared punk dead. The Sex Pistols were gone, and the Clash were busy discovering rockabilly, rap and funk. But in the industrial cities of the UK, Bristol, Birmingham, Stoke-on-Trent, punk wasn't dead. It was just getting faster and angrier. This transition period between 1979 and the early 80s is often called UK 82, or the birth of UK hardcore. The safety pin era of fashion was replaced by leather jackets, studs and mohawks. Think about the punks you see in the films of the early 80s. You'll get the look. Musically, the melody of 1977 was being stripped away in favour of the faster tempo and a more aggressive, nihilistic worldview. Vice Squad sat right in the middle of this. They weren't as crusty or metallic as the band Discharge, but they were far too fast or raw for the radio. Vice Squad formed in Bristol in 1978. The original lineup consisted of Becky Bondage, or Rebecca Bond, on vocals, Dave Bateman on guitar, Mark Healy on bass, and Shane Baldwin on drums. At the time, Becky was only 15 years old. In a scene dominated by aggressive, often monochromatic masculinity, Becky Bondage became an instant sensation. She was charismatic, she had the look, and she could actually sing. The band spent their early years playing youth clubs and local pubs, slowly building a following in the West Country. The band's first major milestone was the formation of Riot City Records in 1980. This was a label founded by their manager Simon Edwards to release Vice Squad's music. It became one of the most influential independent punk labels of the decade. Their debut EP, Last Rockers, was released in late 1980 and spent 40 weeks on the UK indie chart, peaking at number 7. Out of Reach was released as a bridge track between the EPs and albums in February 1982. By this point, the band was the big thing in the underground. The song itself, a perfect example of the UK 82 sound. It's fast, pushing towards that hardcore tempo, but it retains a pop sensibility in the vocal hooks. Lyrically, Out of Reach deals with the classic punk themes of alienation and the feeling of being trapped by societal expectations. In the context of 1981 Britain, a year defined by the Brixton riots, record high unemployment and the escalating Cold War, the refrain of something being called out of reach resonated deeply with a youth population that felt the future had been cancelled. The success of Out of Reach, which hit number 4 on the indie charts, though it only reached number 66 on the UK Top 40, was the final push the band needed to jump to the majors. Shortly after this release, Vice Squad signed with EMI's subsidiary Zonophone. This move was controversial. In the burgeoning hardcore scene, signing to a major label was often seen as the ultimate betrayal, selling out. The song helped their debut album, No Cause for Concern, reach number 32 in the UK Albums chart later that year. However, the pressure of the major label machine and internal friction led to Becky Bondage leaving after a US and Canadian tour in 1982. Vice Squad proved that the second wave of punk wasn't just noise. It was a viable movement that bridged the gap between the art school antics of the 70s and the sheer velocity of 80s hardcore. For track 10, we return to the Robert Palmer story. But he's still not the addicted to love Robert Palmer yet, the one with the power suit and the battalion of identical robotic models. No, we're in the early 80s. He's living in Nassau, Bahamas, right across from Compass Point Studios. He's the guy who gave us Johnny and Mary in 1980, a twitchy synth-pop masterpiece which we heard in episode 13. Great song, by the way. That song suggested he was moving away from the Sneakin' Sally New Orleans funk and into the cold neon light of the new wave. But Robert Palmer was never just one thing. He was a musical hodgepodge, a man who bounced around genres so much it frustrated his label as it made him difficult to market. In 1982, he's putting together an album called Maybe It's Live. It's a weird hybrid, 6 live tracks and 4 new studio recordings. And one of those songs is a cover that he almost didn't realise was a cover. A track that stripped away the soul and replaced it with a sleek digital anxiety. This is Some Guys Have All the Luck. Press play now. We return to find Robert Palmer in a state of creative confusion. He's working with Moon Martin, the guy who wrote Bad Case of Loving You. And he tells Moon he's writing this new song called Some Guys Have All the Luck. A few days later, Moon tells him, I've just heard someone singing that in the studio across the road. Palmer is confused because he hasn't even finished writing it. It turns out he'd subliminally heard the song on Australian radio and only remembered the title line. The song he accidentally rewrote was actually a 1973 R&B hit by the Persuaders, written by a man named Jeff Fortgang. But when Robert Palmer gets his hands on it, he doesn't just cover it, he guts it. He changes the melody, he changes the lyrics, he turns a soulful lament about a guy crying on a bus into a jittery synth-driven, slightly cynical piece of pop art. When Robert Palmer's version of Some Guys Have All the Luck dropped in January 1982, it became his only British top 20 single at that point, peaking at number 16. It's a fascinating moment in his career because it bridges the gap between his experimental 70s output and the MTV superstardom that was only a few years away. The original writer, Jeff Fortgang, who was a Yale graduate and later a Harvard Medical School instructor, told Songfacts that Palmer's version was barely recognisable other than the hook. Palmer had applied a trivial veneer to the song, a phrase he used to describe the style without substance that he felt he was being criticised for at the time. This version is lean. It's got that compass point crunch. It's Robert Palmer proving he could take a piece of classic R&B and make it sound like it was born in a laboratory in 1982. It also set the stage for Rod Stewart to take the song even higher 2 years later, though Rod eventually started using Palmer's arrangement in live shows as a tribute after Robert's death. But in '82, Palmer was still the cool, detached outsider. He was producing Jamaican ska legends like Desmond Dekker and hanging out with members of Duran Duran, a friendship that would eventually lead to the Power Station and change the course of 80s rock. For now, though, he was just a guy in Nassau making one of the weirdest, most successful accidental covers in pop history. For track 11, we're back with the voice of the 1 in 10, UB40. 1 in 10 was the peak of UB40's early militant era, a song we heard in episode 27.5. Released in July 1981, it was a scathing critique of Margaret Thatcher's Britain, where unemployment in the West Midlands had hit nearly 10%. The band didn't just sing about the dole, they were named after the form 40 used to claim it. They were the voice of a disenfranchised generation, a multicultural 8-piece from Birmingham playing heavy political dub that felt like the pulse of the 1981 socio-economic problems. But by 1982, the band was reaching a crossroads. Their second album, Present Arms, had been a success, but the pressure to follow it up led them to Dublin to record their third studio effort, UB44. This brings us to a song that Ali Campbell later described as a favourite UB40 track. Not because it was a global smash, but because of its strange, hazy origins. This is I Won't Close My Eyes. Press play now. I Won't Close My Eyes was released as a single on February the 5th, 1982. It peaked at number 32 in the UK, a respectable showing but a dip from the top 10 heights of 1 in 10. The song was written by the band's saxophonist Brian Travers, and it carries a different weight than their previous hits. The story of this song and the album it came from, UB44, is one of creative friction and, by Ali Campbell's own admission, cocaine madness. The band had decamped to Dublin, which Ali jokingly called the cocaine capital of Europe at the time. They were young, they were famous, and they were, perhaps for the first time, struggling with the execution of their ideas. Ali later reflected that while the tunes on the album were great, they weren't executed well because the band was too distracted by their lifestyle to get much work done. However, I Won't Close My Eyes was the exception that they reworked later, and it remains a haunting piece of music. While the band's earlier work, like Food for Thought, was an overt protest against the hypocrisy of Christmas and global famine, I Won't Close My Eyes shifted their lens inwards. It maintained their early militancy, that burden of shame mentioned in their earlier tracks, but with a more atmospheric dub-heavy production. The singer was backed with the track Politician, a dub-inflected poke at the political establishment that showed the band hadn't entirely lost their edge. Yet, the lukewarm reception of UB44, advertised as their fourth album because of a previous remix LP, pushed the band towards a radical pivot. Just a year after I Won't Close My Eyes, the band would record Labour of Love, a collection of reggae covers that would change their trajectory forever. They would go from the Birmingham Dole Q Poets to the guys who made Neil Diamond's Red Red Wine a global anthem. An irony, considering they famously didn't even realise Neil Diamond wrote it at the time. I Won't Close My Eyes stands as a final document of that transitional period, a moment where the band was still searching for a way to balance their socialist ideals with the pressures of the pop machine. Next up, it's time to introduce a girl group who will have, well, such an innovative first half of the 80s. and then have an entire second commercial life with Stock Aitken and Waterman in the second half of the 80s. By the way, this particular group was the first album I ever bought for myself, for better or for worse, but we'll come to them. First, we need Stuart Hall, Linval Golding and Neville Staples, namely Funboy 3. When we last spoke about Funboy 3, they were huddled in the darkness of 1981, shivering through the clinical, paranoid sketches of the lunatics have taken over the asylum. The three had just walked away from the juggernaut that was the Specials. They had traded the frantic upbeat of two-tone for something sparser, weirder and decidedly more brittle. It was music for a Britain that felt like it was changing, but into what? But pop music is a restless creature. It doesn't like to stay in the bunker for too long. Sometimes the only way to escape the asylum is to throw the doors open and invite the party in. This next song is a pivotal moment in the 1980s. It is the sound of the avant-garde accidentally stumbling into the top 5. It is a cover of a 1939 jazz standard that, in the hands of 3 ex-specialists and 3 fashion school dropouts, became a definitive anthem of Cool Britannia before the term was even a marketing slogan. Let's now introduce that little-known girl group. It's Bananarama, and the song is It Ain't What You Do, It's the Way That You Do It. This is track 12. So we've had the Funboy 3. Let's talk about the Fab Girl 3, Bananarama. Long before they were the Guinness World Record holding girl group of the 80s, they were just 3 friends, Sarah Darling, Karen Woodward and Siobhan Fahey, living in London, obsessed with the punk aesthetic but yearning for something more melodic. Sarah and Karen had been friends since childhood in Bristol. After moving to London to study journalism, they met Siobhan, who was studying at the London College of Fashion. They weren't manufactured, they didn't go to stage school. In fact, they were living in the rehearsal rooms above the Sex Pistols' old practice space on Denmark Street. Their early vibe was less pop star and more coolest girls at the club. They sang backing vocals for the Monochrome Set, Iggy Pop, Department S and many more, and were heavily influenced by the punk DIY ethos of the time. Their debut single, Ayemwana, was sung in Swahili, a bold, non-commercial choice that nevertheless caught the ear of a certain Terry Hall. Terry Hall saw a photograph of Bananarama in the Face magazine. He was struck by their look, the dungarees, the messy hair, the look of utter nonchalance. But more importantly, he heard Ayemwana and loved the raw, unpolished nature of their vocals. At the time, Funboy 3 were working on their debut album. They had a track based on the old Cy Oliver and James Trummy Young jazz classic, famously recorded by Ella Fitzgerald and Jimmy Lunsford. Hall felt the track needed a female energy to counteract the trio's dry, brooding delivery. He called the girls directly. As Siobhan Fahey later recalled in various interviews, the invitation was unexpected. They were fans of the Specials, and suddenly they were being asked to contribute to the new project of the most respected figures in the pop scene. The recording session at Air Studios was, by all accounts, a chaotic clash of styles. Funboy 3 were minimalist. They wanted the track to feel rhythmic and sparse. Bananarama brought a rough-hewn unison singing style that flew in the space of the polished session singer sound of the era. In a Guardian interview, the girls said, "We were like, he thinks we're proper singers," said Darlin. It took them days to record their parts because, says Fahey, they just couldn't get it together in the studio. I read an interview with Terry where he said they were impossible. We'd be counted in and then just fall about laughing. The song is built on a basic shuffling drum pattern and a prominent walking bass line. The genius of the arrangement lies in the contrast. The Funboy 3 providing the rhythmic backbone and the deadpan, almost spoken verses. Bananarama provide the female, yet notably unvibrato harmonies that give the song its infectious playground chant quality. The lyrics are simple, almost a Zen koan for the pop industry. It ain't what you do, it's the way that you do it, and that's what gets results. For a group of musicians who had just fractured one of the biggest bands in England to do their things their own way, the sentiment was autobiographical. Released in early 1982, the song peaked at number 4 on the UK singles chart, and most importantly, it changed the trajectory for both groups. For Funboy 3, it proved they weren't just a grim experimental project, they were hit makers. For Bananarama, it was the ultimate launch pad. In a reciprocal deal, Funboy 3 returned the favour by appearing on Bananarama's next single, Really Saying Something, which also became a massive hit. We will hear both acts many times more on this pod, Bananarama especially. In a 1982 interview with NME, the groups discussed the collaboration as a rejection of the overly produced synthesizer-heavy, new romantic sound that was now dominating the airwaves. They wanted something that felt human, slightly flawed, and undeniably British. The word masterclass gets overused, but this song remains a masterclass in collaboration. It's what happens when you pair the cynical wit of Coventry with the art school cool of London. It turned a jazz relic into a modern manifesto. It wasn't about technical perfection, it was about the way that they did it. For our final track on playlist 36, we are back with the boys from Basildon, Depeche Mode. And now we're in that strange transitional pocket of time between the fluorescent sugar rush of 1981 and the industrial strength gloom that would eventually make Basildon's Finest the biggest synth band on the planet and national treasures. When we last left Depeche Mode, they were riding the high of Just Can't Get Enough, which we heard in episode 29.5. It was catchy, it was bright, and it was written by Vince Clarke, the man who, at that point, was effectively the band's engine room. But then in December 1981, Vince left. He vanished into the fog of a burgeoning career with Yazoo. And for a moment, the music press, and honestly maybe even the band, thought the story was over. You've lost your chief architect. You've lost the guy who wrote the hits. Your 3 kids from Essex with a bunch of synthesizers and a giant question mark where your future used to be. Except there was this other guy, the quiet one in the band with the blonde curls, who had mostly been seen standing in the background. He's a guy called Martin Gore, and as it turns out, Martin had been busy. While Vince was busy perfecting the art of the perfect 3-minute pop song, Martin had been hoarding demos. He had a stash of songs dating back to when he was 16 or 17 years old. Songs that were a little bit more melancholic, a little more personal, and a lot less about new life, and a lot more about, well, longing. The band didn't panic. They didn't hold auditions for a new songwriter. They just booked studio time at Blackwing. They walked in as a trio, Dave, Martin and Andy, and they dusted off one of these old teenage compositions. It was a song about wanting to see someone again. Simple, innocent, a little bit desperate. It was called See You. This is track 13, playlist 36, our final song today. Released in January 1982, See You was the first Depeche Mode single written entirely by Martin Gore. And if there was any doubt about whether the band could survive without Vince Clarke, the charts provided a pretty definitive answer. See You climbed all the way to number 6 on the UK singles chart. To put that in perspective, it actually outperformed every single Vince had written for them up to that point. But let's talk about the vibe of this recording, because it's a fascinating bridge between the old Mode and the new. It was recorded in December 1981 at Blackwing Studios in London with producer Daniel Miller. This was a DIY operation in the truest sense. Martin's original demo for the song was famously basic. Just a melody played on a Casio synth while he tapped the beat with his foot. To get the sounds they wanted, the band started experimenting with new gear. Martin had just bought a PPG Wave 2 synthesizer with his royalties. It was one of the first digital wavetable synths, powerful but notoriously temperamental. Daniel Miller later recalled that the choir sound you hear on the track, that ghostly digital wash, came straight out of that unreliable PPG. Recording it wasn't exactly a glamorous rock star experience though. Because they were still living in Basildon, the band had to catch the last train back from London every night. Martin later described these as dodgy trains full of drunkards where they'd frequently get into fights, sometimes because they were recognised and sometimes just because of what they called pure Essex violence. Lyrically, the song is a document of teenage obsession. Martin has admitted he wrote it when he was 16, and while it's a story about a specific personal experience, he confessed in 1982 that he added things here and there to make it more interesting, because it would be too boring to hear what really happened. And then there's the music video, directed by Julian Temple. It features a very young-looking Dave Garn at Hounslow train station, getting in a photo booth as some pictures of a woman are printed. Martin Gore dialing numbers in an old red telephone box, before we jump to Woolworths with Andy Fletcher playing notes on one of the tills. But the real Easter egg here is the first appearance of Alan Wilder. Alan had just been hired as a touring keyboard player to replace the space left by Vince. He didn't play a single note on the recording of See You, but you can see him in the video. The band actually grew to dislike the video so much that they kept it off their 1985 collection Some Great Videos. Even Martin himself has cooled on the song over the years, saying in 2001 that he doesn't feel much affection for it, feeling like he was just trying to copy Vince's style at the time. But regardless of how the band feels now, See You was proof of concept. It proved that Martin Gore was a hitmaker. It proved Depeche Mode was a brand, not just a vehicle for one guy's songwriting. It set the stage for a broken frame and everything that followed. So that's the end of playlist 36. I do hope you found some old favourites in there and maybe fell a little in love with that Bohannon track we opened today with. Love that one. But the party continues in playlist 37. Join us next week as we reach Valentine's Day 1982 with some quite unromantic songs. Black Sabbath finally make an appearance without Ozzy. Kiss finally make an appearance with A World Without Heroes. ABC shoot their poison arrow, and the Jam find a town called Malice. We also meet the Associates, and most importantly, the Jay Giles Band with their massive hit Centerfold, probably the most romantic song of the episode. As always, if you can leave us a review or hit subscribe, it all helps. But until next time, have a lovely week. Take care.